Syracuse is playing Houston and Kansas in Vegas this upcoming season. Do they have any sort of chance of getting out of there with a split? Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on this week's Poll Friday, I asked you all a very simple question. How will Syracuse basketball do in its 2 games guaranteed in Vegas this upcoming season in the second annual Players Era NIL Tournament? They're going up against the Houston Cougars and the Kansas Jayhawks. Will they go 1-1? Will they go 0-2? Will they even go 2-0? That's what we're going to talk about here on this week's Poll Friday. Before we get into the results of the poll, let's set the stage together. Let's go to the backstory. About a year and a half ago, all right, from right now, there were multiple reports out there saying that Syracuse basketball was going to play in the new Vegas Era NIL Tournament for the 2025-26 season. The first annual Vegas Era Tournament was actually last year, but it was significantly less teams. This year, they upped it up to 18. This tournament is unique, and the reason why it's unique is because every participating team gets $1 million in NIL just for showing up. So Syracuse basketball, all they got to do is go to Vegas, play in 3 games, 2 we already know the opponent of, and they walk away with $1 million. That's same with every team. And as an extra bonus, as an extra incentive to do well in the tournament and not just show up and mail it in, if you win, if you're the best team in the tournament, you're going to get an additional $1 million in NIL. So it's a no-brainer for every team that is invited to go to Vegas to play in this tournament to go. Because worst case scenario, yeah, you might get your butts kicked, but guess what? You're going to get $1 million in NIL, whether you lose by 33 times or you win by 33 times. And if you win by 33 times, you win the whole thing and you're going to get $1 million more in NIL. So it is a no-brainer. If you get the chance to go to Vegas to play in this tournament as a team, you go. So Syracuse is doing that. We know the 18 teams that are participating this year, and they are mostly really good programs. And the schedule came out earlier this week, and we know that Syracuse, their 2 games are going to be against Houston and Kansas. And depending on how those matchups go and what happens elsewhere, we'll know what the 3rd game is going to be in late November after those first 2 games. And the draw is admittedly very, very tough for Syracuse basketball. We're going to get to that in the next segment here on this Poll Friday. But to be fair to you all, there are no bad teams in this tournament, this group of 18. The quote-unquote worst teams in the tournament, aside maybe from Syracuse basketball, for being honest, are UNLV, St. Joe's, Rutgers, and Notre Dame. UNLV has had 4 consecutive seasons of being over 500. St. Joe's has won 43 games over the past 2 seasons, including an upset over Texas Tech a year ago. Remember that in the Legends Classic in Brooklyn? Syracuse was going to play St. Joe's, but then they all of a sudden said, you know what? We're just going to upset Texas Tech. So St. Joe's is not a pushover program, and actually Syracuse is going to play St. Joe's right before this tournament. But this is one of the quote-unquote worst teams in this Vegas Era Challenge. And then Rutgers and Notre Dame, are high major programs. That's it. Syracuse also could have been matched up if it wasn't Houston and it wasn't Kansas. It could have been Auburn. It could have been Alabama. It could have been Gonzaga, St. John's, Baylor. Michigan is in the tournament. Oregon, Iowa State, Creighton. I'm probably missing a stool or two out there that's really good, and I don't mean any disrespect, but you get the idea. It almost felt like no matter what, Syracuse was going to get a tough draw unless they managed to get UNLV maybe or St. Joe's in the tournament instead of playing them before the tournament, or a Rutgers. They weren't going to play Notre Dame because that's an ACC team. Point being is that it was going to be difficult no matter what, because again, it goes back to what I have been saying. It's a no-brainer when you're invited to this tournament to play in it. It's $1 million in NIL just for showing up. And here are the results. Let's get to the results of this week's Poll Friday, okay? There were over 250 votes, and I am not surprised by the results at all because I feel the exact same way as I did a few days ago when we saw the schedule be released. And that is that Syracuse is probably going to go 0-2 against Houston and Kansas. In fact, over 60% of you all voted that way. In second place was 1-1, and in third place was 2-0. Again, I'm picking Syracuse to go 0-2, and we'll talk about Houston and Kansas coming up. But I will say this, and I'm going to save it really for the end. You're allowed to upset teams. So with that in mind, let's talk about Houston and Kansas next on Locked On Syracuse. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping, and that's where Gametime comes in. Gametime makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you could save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. Tired of endless strolling, trying to find the best deal? Gametime's zone deals pick the best seats in your section for you. Take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE, for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer. On this week's Poll Friday, I asked you all the question, how will Syracuse basketball do in its first two games in the Vegas Players Era NIL Tournament against Houston and Kansas? The majority of you all voted that Syracuse will go 0-2, and I also unfortunately agree that the Orange will go 0-2. I just want you to keep in mind that I am a Syracuse fan. I am a Syracuse alum, so I want to be as optimistic as possible when talking about Syracuse, but I also have to try to be somewhat objective and not always have on the orange-colored glasses. And when I look at Houston and Kansas on the schedule, this is going to be really difficult for Syracuse. So with that being said, let's talk about Houston and Kansas. And in my opinion, Houston is the tougher of the two opponents, at least trying to forecast to late November. All right. I understand that it is technically July 4th. Also, happy July 4th to every one of you all. Right. Happy July 4th. There's still a long time until late November. But as of right now, it seems like Houston will be the most challenging of the two games. In fact, they might just win the whole Vegas Era Challenge. This is a team that's coming off a national title appearance a year ago under Kelvin Sampson, and they've been incredible really since 2017. They have made the tournament every year since 2017, except for 2020, which was the COVID year. And oh, by the way, they would have made the tournament in 2020. But this is a team, not only have they made the tournament every year since 2017, they have been a 6 seed or better in those seasons. And in one of those seasons, Houston actually knocked out Syracuse basketball. That was in 2021 in the Sweet 16. This is going to be a preseason top 5 team in the nation. They have 2 of their leading scorers coming back in Emmanuel Sharp and Milos Uzan. They also brought in a 6'10", 230-pound, 5-star true freshman center in Chris Cenac. Remember, Syracuse actually offered Chris Cenac. We were hoping that Syracuse would get him as part of their 2025 recruiting class. But aside from an initial offer, that was about it with Syracuse and Chris Cenac. He ends up going to Houston, and now Houston has legitimate size, which is scary because that's the one thing they've kind of lacked the past few seasons is size, and it pretty much hasn't mattered because they are still an elite defensive team basically every single season. They go far in the NCAA tournament basically every season. They just haven't quite gotten over the hump just yet, but they are still an incredible team. And honestly, the only way that Syracuse has any sort of chance of upsetting a team like Houston is to beat them at their own game. That's part of the reason why it's so difficult to beat a team like Houston, because they dictate how the game is going to go with how good their defense is. Syracuse is essentially going to have to try to beat them 55-50. And could Syracuse hold Houston down enough to where they can beat them? I don't know, because it's not like Syracuse projects to be a good defensive team. And on top of that, Houston could also win a game where they're not doing well offensively. They could beat you 52-41. It sounds nuts, but that's the reality. They could easily hold Syracuse to 1 point per 40 minutes, if you think about it. They could. So this is going to be a really difficult game against Houston. Kansas is the quote-unquote easier of the 2 opponents, but this is still going to be a preseason top 25 team. But Kansas is very interesting, very weird to gauge this upcoming season. In 2022, under Bill Self, and they're still under Bill Self, their head coach, they won the national championship. Hip, hip, hooray for the Kansas Jayhawks. However, since that point, they have underachieved relative to their preseason expectations. In 2023, Kansas was a top 5 team in the preseason. They have a great year. They're a number 1 seed. It looks like they might be able to repeat as national champs, and they lose in the round of 32. In 2024, they get Hunter Dickinson out of the transfer portal from Michigan. He was the top player in the portal. They're the preseason favorite. They're the number 1 team in the nation, and they underachieved. They lose again in the round of 32, and it wasn't as a 1 seed. It was as a 4 seed, which for Kansas, a 4 seed is not that good for them. This is one of the bluest of blue bloods in the country, the Kansas Jayhawks. And then in 2025, they're again preseason number 1 in the nation, and they massively underachieve relative to their expectations. They enter the NCAA tournament as a 7 seed, and they lose in the round of 64, and I believe that came against Arkansas in a thrilling 7-10 matchup. That's the first time, trust me, I looked this up on Basketball Reference, so unless Basketball Reference is wrong or my eyes are deceiving me, these facts are correct. This is how good Kansas is normally as a program. That first round exit was the first time they lost in the round of 64 since 2006. That is 19 years. They've made the tournament every year since 2006, obviously, except for the COVID year where there was no tournament, and they probably would have been a 1 seed in that COVID year. The last time that Kansas was outside the preseason top 10 was in 2011. The last time they were outside the preseason top 20 was in 2005. When the first AP poll comes out, I would not be surprised if Kansas is not a top 10 team, and I would not be surprised if they're not a top 20 team, but they should firmly be in the top 25. They are still a really good team for this upcoming season. They just might not have the same preseason expectations that they've had in the past. A lot of their success is going to depend on 5-star true freshman guard Darryn Peterson. But Darryn Peterson is probably going to live up to expectations, considering on 24/7 Sports, he is quite literally the number one player in the country. Oh, but what about the guy from BYU? Well, if you look at the 24/7 Sports composite rankings, Darryn Peterson is second in the nation. So he's either the number one or number two true freshman in the country. Darryn Peterson is likely going to be an All-American in this college basketball season. I guess the hope, and this is really a stretch for Syracuse, is that because you're playing Kansas early in the year, it's only going to be late November, that Darryn Peterson is still adjusting to playing in college basketball. Okay, but that's a stretch. And even if he is adjusting, maybe he isn't quite living up to expectations around the time when Syracuse is going to play them, they still have guys like Jaden Dawson and Trey White, who they got out of the transfer portal. It's also Kansas. They're good even in their down years. Their down year was last year. They were a 7 seed. I think as Syracuse fans, we would all accept Syracuse being a 7 seed for this upcoming season. So what does this really all mean? I'm picking Syracuse to go 0-2. Most of you who are watching and listening to this podcast are also picking Syracuse to go 0-2 against Houston and Kansas. But you want to know what's funny about tournament teams? They all seem to have one major commonality, because every tournament team maybe is built a little different, right? Maybe they're more of an offensive team. Maybe they're more of an up-tempo team. Maybe they're a team like Houston where they rely on their defense to win them games for the most part. Maybe they're a 3-point shooting team. They're kind of like Louisville, where they're just going to jack up a ton of threes and hope they make them. And if they don't make them, they might just lose. You could build, there is no set way you have to build your team to make the NCAA tournament or even to win a national championship. But every tournament team shares one commonality, unless you're North Carolina from a year ago, and that is you beat good teams. I know I said that firmly, but if you want to make the NCAA tournament, if you're Syracuse, you're going to have to beat some good teams, because that's what they all do. You think Kansas and Houston go to the tournament every year playing nobodies? Nope. In fact, they're in the same conference. They got to play each other. Sometimes 3 times a year. You got to beat good teams in order to make the NCAA tournament. And even though I'm picking Syracuse to go 0-2, and most of you all are picking Syracuse to go 0-2, I checked the rule book, and Syracuse is allowed to pull off an upset. You don't have to be better than Kansas or Houston on paper. You don't have to be better than them record-wise when the season is over. One of those two teams could win the national title. Syracuse is not going to win the national title next season. Even in my wildest imagination, I cannot see that happening. But you only got to be better than one of those teams in one game. That's it. And isn't that kind of what March Madness is all about when you get to the NCAA tournament? It's not about being the best team in the tournament. It's, can you be the best team in one game? And then you move to the next game, and can you be the better team? And so on and so forth. Go ask Duke last year when they lost to Houston what it felt like. Duke last year was better than Houston. They were more consistent than Houston. They were a better team. They were controlling that game in the NCAA tournament for 38 of the 40 minutes. But Houston won in the end. And they almost won the national title. And they were not the best team. Duke was the best team. They lost in the Final Four. It's all about, can you be better on one game? So can Syracuse do that against one of those two teams? I guess we'll find out. But if they want to make the NCAA tournament, they're going to have to beat good teams. And hopefully they can get a split, prove myself wrong, and prove most of you all wrong. I'll turn it over to you. How do you think Syracuse is going to do against Houston and Kansas? Comment in the comment section below. As far as what is coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future here, tomorrow is obviously a big day for Syracuse football recruiting. Obviously, a very, very huge day. Julius Miles is committing, I think, in the afternoon. He's a 3-star tight end from Freeport, Florida. Syracuse is in his top 3 list of schools, along with Florida State and Louisville. The buzz around him, it seems like Louisville was the favorite, although I'm not sure if that's the case anymore. I guess we'll find out. I would not be surprised if Syracuse walked away with Julius Miles tomorrow. But the big one is obviously 5-star wide receiver Calvin Russell. And it really seems like it's going to come down to Michigan and Syracuse football. He's not announcing his decision until 9 p.m. Eastern on Saturday night. And unfortunately, with timing, because Calvin Russell is doing this at 9 p.m. Eastern, I'm not going to be available in all likelihood to record a podcast, whether it's good or bad. And I apologize for that. But what I can promise you, if I cannot record on Saturday night, whether it's good news or bad news with Calvin Russell and or Julius Miles, is that I will do a weekend podcast on Sunday recapping what happened on Saturday. Again, whether they get Calvin Russell or not, there will be a podcast on Sunday. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Again, I apologize that I am probably not going to be available on Saturday night. All right? But hopefully Syracuse could at least walk away with one of those 2 recruits. Also, I want to bring your attention to this, that on July 7th, so that is 3 days from the time of this recording here. So July 7th, let me check my calendar app real quick. That is on Monday. 3-star offensive lineman Xavier Payne is set to make his college decision. Xavier Payne is a former Florida State commit, but he decommitted recently. And the 2 perceived front runners, and it seems like it's really only these 2 schools, is Syracuse and Colorado. And again, like I have been saying for a while, just like how Fran Brown is an ace recruiter, and you can never really count out Fran Brown with Syracuse football. He's always going to have Syracuse in the hunt. You cannot count out a guy like Deion Sanders over at Colorado. So that's more recruiting news for you all. Again, the big things, though, are happening tomorrow on Saturday. This is almost like the calm before the storm with Julius Miles and Calvin Russell. And again, I'm posting a podcast on Sunday, especially if I cannot do one on Saturday night, which it doesn't look like I will be able to do. But that is it for this podcast. And thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On Portal Show with football recruiting expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors, portal entries, and signings each and every day. And I'm sure he's going to talk a lot about Julius Miles and Calvin Russell. And hopefully we can get on Brian Smith here on the Locked On Syracuse podcast in the near future, and especially if Syracuse is able to land one of those 2 players. And on the on this Locked On Portal podcast, you can be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. Find the Portal podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe. Tell all your friends about Locked On Syracuse, because it helps the channel grow to reach all Syracuse Orange fans. And of course, shout out to all of you who continue to like and subscribe to Locked On Syracuse each and every day. You all are truly the best. And now I'm actually looking at the timing. It turns out that we made this Poll Friday a full podcast. That wasn't my intention going into the podcast to make it a full podcast, but guess what? That's how the timing turned out. I hit that record button and I just started talking, and hopefully you all enjoyed. So thank you, and I will see you all again very soon.